been kind of rough going for Half-Life fans recently. Not only have we all had to come to grips with the fact that Episode 3 is probably never going to happen, but we also had to endure the awful hunt down the Freeman. A game that tried to take the existing storyline into its own hands and try and salvage what it could, telling a story running parallel to the events of Half-Life 1 and 2. But I doubt I need to tell you how it all turned out. Spoiler, it was a steaming pile of shit.
You fucked up my face.
We did get that kind of leaked script, or whatever you want to call it, that basically outlined the plans that Valve had with wrapping the whole thing up. But I mean, let's not mince words. The cold hard truth of finding out that we probably are never going to see Half-Life 3 is a bitter pill to swallow. But all hope is not lost, because recently there's been a fantastic single-player mod called Half-Life Echoes that's done what Hunt Down the Freeman tried to do but failed, which was use the foundation upon what the Half-Life series is built on and tell an interesting story. On top of that, including clever level design and enjoyable gameplay. This mod even uses plot elements from some of the information we got leaked about Episode 3, and there's references to characters from Half-Life 2 thrown into the mix.
Man, that sounded bad.
Now, having said that, this video might be considered a little bit spoiler heavy. The mod isn't really all that long, and I didn't have that much footage to work with, but I've tried to get things to a minimum in terms of what gets shown. But look, if you're really that worried about it, I'd suggest go playing the mod, then come back and watch my video. I'll still be here, I promise. Now, it's a little bit ambiguous as to who you're playing, as I think you're just some random scientist working for Black Mesa, who for some reason is really good at shooting things. The game starts off with you moving around the Black Mesa facility on the same day that Gordon Freeman and the rest of the eggheads in the Anomalous Materials Department cause the resonance cascade that turns the facility into a war zone, and basically just fucks up planet Earth from that point on. It's really cool walking around the facility, interacting with random NPCs and seeing a side of the base we've not seen before, a lot of which is entirely new and original. Throughout this prologue sequence, there's this huge sense of foreboding. I mean, we all know what's coming, and it's just a matter of when, not if. Sure enough, eventually the entire base is rattled as Gordon does his thing, opening portals throughout the base as the Zen creatures swarm in and start ruining everyone's day. I think every Half-Life game in the official mods have always handled their prologues pretty well in terms of setting everything up and making the tension so thick that you could cut it with a crowbar. And anyone who's played the Half-Life games knows they're a bit of a slow burn, and Echoes doesn't do things any differently. So don't expect to start off with a shotgun, crossbow or RPG right from the beginning. You can expect to spend a fair bit of time unarmed. In fact, you spend a considerable amount of time in this mod without any weapons. I'd say maybe 25% of the entire thing. And then even when you do get the crowbar, you're mostly just up against head crabs and head crab zombies, both of which are often easier just avoiding than trying to tackle head on. Especially the head crabs, which still retain their rank as one of the most annoying motherfuckers in the entire Half-Life series, along with the hound eyes and snarks. Now, Echoes does play along similar beats to the other games. It's a mix of exploration, combat, and some light puzzle solving, most of which involve just like activating a button or some kind of lever. They're not terribly challenging if you're at all familiar with the series, and they just require a bit of common sense. The first few areas are mostly underground and against the Zen creatures like the Vortigons, the bull squids, and the head crabs. You don't have all that much ammo at this point, and it almost feels like survival horror in some ways, especially if you're playing on hard mode. Then the military is slowly introduced. Now, you initially only see them from a distance during a scripted sequence, before they start showing up during actual combat. Combat against the military is pretty good without being amazing, and these guys show off half-decent artificial intelligence, throwing grenades your way if you stand still for too long and being quite aggressive and rushing a position. But a shotgun blast to the face or a headshot from the Colt Python's going to take him out pretty quickly. Then finally, the last few areas in the game kind of mirror surface tension from Half-Life 1, where you're on the surface engaging in almost constant gunfights with the military, but now also trading shots with them and the Zen creatures as the entire place is engaged in all-out warfare. This is a kind of every man for himself situation, and you're always given the upper hand in these scenarios, dropped into the middle of a fight between both groups and able to choose how you want to engage them. It's a pacing tactic that worked in Half-Life 1, and it works here again in Echoes. I mean, if you're going to be thrust straight into the action from the get-go, there'd be no time to get used to the weapons and the behaviour of enemies. But slowly progressing things along like this gives the player the time to accommodate themselves with the kind of enemies they're going to come up against. It's a constant crescendo that just keeps on rising, throwing more and more challenges at the player, but also making sure that challenge is implemented properly. And this carries over to the weapons. So you start off with the crowbar, then you get a pistol, the shotgun, and eventually the machine gun and most of the other weapons. Now look, I'd love to shoot a skybox for 12 minutes and show you all the new guns, but sadly, it's just the original lineup from before, not that that's really a bad thing. Almost all of Half-Life's guns are rudimentary, but they are workhorse and they all serve a purpose. But like I said before, the progression of acquiring these guns is handled pretty well, and there was only like a couple of times early on when I started to get a bit irritated about how slow things were feeling. You'll interact with other NPCs along the way too, and what I think was a good choice too was reusing existing dialogue and voice lines instead of hiring voice actors to do new stuff, or heaven forbid, the modders doing the voice acting themselves.
Please!
One thing I always find laughable in Half-Life mods is when the modders try their hand at voice acting. It's rarely a good idea and it never really works out. Go listen to some of the dialogue in Underhell to see what I'm talking about.
You're just trying to get rid of me, man.
Also too, if you get multiple people doing this on different microphones, you have that problem too where someone's dialogue sounds entirely different to someone else's, because of the acoustics of the room they recorded it in or the microphone they used. My point is, what they've done here is a smarter idea. There's a couple of instances where I'd say these moments with the other NPCs almost border into being an escort quest. The pathfinding in the Half-Life game's always been kinda dogshit, and this mod just again kinda proves it. But thankfully these segments are pretty short and look, they just require a bit of patience. Visually, the level design in Half-Life Echoes also shows a real sense of polish. There's some really good looking environments in this mod, especially early on during the moments when the shit has hit the fan and things are crumbling around you, quite literally. The higher polygon count with the level design and some of the lighting effects just looks great. I think it's probably one of the best looking mods to run on the GoldSrc engine. I mean, I'm not any kind of authority on Half-Life mods, but I struggle to think of something off the top of my head that looks better. Outside of how their environments look visually, also the way they function during gameplay and combat is really good too. Now I'd say that roughly the last 25% of the mod is mostly combat against the Marines, and anyone who's played the Half-Life games knows how crappy the shooting can sometimes be, because combat's almost entirely based around line of sight. A lot of the areas you fight the HEC, you often have plenty of objects you're able to use as cover, allowing for the player to make sure they're not always exposing themselves and have a means of breaking line of sight, and not getting pelted by like half a dozen enemies at once. Aside from that though, during the parts of the mod where you're just exploring or trying to navigate the environment, the use of lighting is really deliberate in trying to be as helpful as possible by using certain colours or just making a light source more obvious to direct your eye to an item or an area of interest. The highlight though, I think, is the scripted sequences, some of which are just really impressive and entertaining. Like watching a bunch of Marines fighting with a Gargantua that's just busted down a giant metal shutter is pretty damn awesome. One thing the original Half-Life did quite well was sort of introduce the whole scripted sequence thing into FPS games. Well look, maybe it didn't introduce it, but it sure did help kind of pioneer it. I mean, it could have been simple things, like in We've Got Hostiles, how enemies would repel out of a chopper. Or something else as simple as a headcrab zombie smashing a door down to give you a bit of a jump scare. The scripted sequences in Echoes are a lot more elaborate to the kind of level we saw in Half-Life 2. On a much larger scale, involving a lot more NPCs and clearly taking a lot more effort and skill to construct.
Did you hear that? No! No! No!
One of the main recurring ones involves this Gargantua that's just chasing after the player for almost the entire campaign, and some of the little instances when you encounter it are really well done. It's also a neat way of shifting the paradigm on how the game plays, like one minute you're feeling in control and like you've got a handle on things, then suddenly this thing turns up and reminds you how insignificant you really are, and you hightail it out of the area to avoid getting roasted or stomped on.
Oh my god, we're doomed!
So what didn't I like about the mod? Well, I mean, I guess it's over too quickly, though that's not really an outright fault. And considering the fact that it's been worked on by mostly one person, I think it's still damn impressive the whole thing's even been made in the first place. Obviously too, if you don't like Half-Life, you're probably not going to like this. I mean, the mod is great, but it's not going to win you over. Whatever you didn't like about Half-Life is still going to be prevalent here too. Overall though, look, I really like the mod and I can't really find any kind of major fault with it. Anything I could think of would just be nitpicking. I mean, for a free mod, the quality here is outstanding. Half-Life Echoes has done a really good job at taking a spin on an existing universe and storyline and trying to do its own thing, and you know what? It does it pretty damn well. If someone bullshitted to me and told me this was some kind of official Valve mod, I probably would have believed them, because it has that same level of polish and quality from the original games, and in some ways even more because it shows a concise and profound understanding of level design and pacing. Hunt Down the Freeman was an insult to the Half-Life modding scene. It was a colossal piece of shit. Half-Life Echoes, however, is an absolute blessing, and I'd suggest anyone who's a fan of Half-Life check it out.
Please!
It's a great throwback that feels like something made back in 1998, but in the best way possible.